In the silence of space, a small alien ship drifted silently toward Earth. Its sleek surface shimmered faintly under the light of the distant sun, blending seamlessly with the stars around it. Inside the craft, Lyra sat nervously at the controls, her delicate hands hovering over glowing panels that hummed softly. She was young, barely out of training, and this mission had been thrust upon her without warning. Her leaders had chosen her because she was expendable, or so they thought. But to Lyra, this wasn't just another task. It was her chance to prove herself. The ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, leaving streaks of fire in its wake. Lyra gripped the edges of her seat as the vessel shook violently. She had never experienced such turbulence before. On her home planet, ships were far more advanced and stable, but this one, an older model sent specifically for stealth, was anything but smooth. As the ground came into view, she scanned the area below, searching for a safe place to land. Her eyes locked onto a dense forest surrounded by rolling hills. It would do. With a final jolt, the ship touched down in a clearing. Dust swirled around the craft as Lyra unbuckled herself and stepped out cautiously. The air smelled strange, thick with scents she couldn't identify. Trees towered above her, their leaves rustling in the breeze. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. This was Earth, a world she had only read about in ancient texts. It looked different from what she'd imagined, more alive. Lyra adjusted the glowing device strapped to her wrist, checking her coordinates. The energy crystals she sought were buried deep within the planet's crust, somewhere near a dormant volcano. Her superiors hadn't given her much information beyond that. They didn't need to. She understood the stakes. If she failed, her people would continue to suffer. Their cities were crumbling, their resources dwindling. These crystals were their last hope. As she walked cautiously through the trees, her silver suit caught the sunlight, shimmering like liquid metal. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb the wildlife. Birds chirped overhead, and small creatures darted between bushes. Everything here seemed so chaotic. Back home, nature was controlled, ordered. Here, it felt wild, unpredictable. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard a noise, a low rumble followed by the sound of an engine. She froze, her heart pounding. Peering through the foliage, she saw a figure standing beside a large metal machine. It was a human male, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing worn clothes stained with grease. He was tinkering with something under the hood of the vehicle, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lyra hesitated, unsure whether to approach him. Humans were unpredictable, according to the data she'd studied. Some were kind, others hostile. But she needed help navigating this unfamiliar terrain. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The man noticed her immediately. His eyes widened in surprise as he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Whoa," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're not from around here, are you?" Lyra tilted her head, studying him. He didn't seem threatening, though his voice was deeper than she expected. She tried to respond, piecing together words she'd learned from the universal translator. "I come in peace," she managed, her accent heavy. The man chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I got that. You look like you just stepped out of a sci-fi movie." He paused, then added, "I'm Jake, by the way." Lyra blinked, unsure how to respond. Names weren't important right now. What mattered was finding the crystals. Still, there was something comforting about the way Jake spoke, calm, almost reassuring. For the first time since landing, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wouldn't have to face this strange world alone after all. Jake watched the strange woman intently, his curiosity outweighing his caution. She looked fragile, almost delicate, with wide eyes that darted around as if taking in every detail of her surroundings. Her silver suit shimmered faintly in the sunlight, and the glowing device on her wrist caught his attention. It pulsed softly, like it was alive. Jake had seen a lot of weird things in his life. Working as a mechanic in a small town meant you encountered all kinds of oddities. but nothing like this. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "You look lost." Lyra hesitated, unsure how to respond. Lost wasn't the right word, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. She was far from home, surrounded by unfamiliar sights and sounds, and standing before a human who seemed both curious and cautious. She nodded slowly, then pointed to herself. "Lyra," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Lyra," Jake repeated, nodding. "Nice to meet you. So, what brings you here? You're not exactly dressed for hiking." Lyra glanced at her suit, then back at Jake. Explaining her mission would be difficult, especially since she didn't fully trust him yet. But she needed help, and he seemed willing to offer it, for now. She tapped the glowing device on her wrist, which projected a faint holographic image into the air. It showed a map of Earth, zooming in on a specific location, a dormant volcano hundreds of miles away. Jake leaned closer, squinting at the projection. "Whoa, that's some fancy tech you've got there. What's that spot?" Lyra pointed to the marked area. "Important," she said simply. "Must go there." Jake frowned, studying her face. There was something urgent in her expression, something that told him this wasn't just a casual trip. "Okay, but why? And why are you doing it? Aren't there, I don't know, professionals or whatever where you come from?" Lyra shook her head. "No time. Only me." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her anxiety. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. This human might think she was brave, but inside, she felt anything but. The weight of her mission pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Jake noticed her unease and softened his tone. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not gonna bite. If you need help getting wherever you're going, I can lend a hand. But you'll have to tell me more than important. Deal?" Lyra hesitated again, weighing her options. Trusting a stranger went against everything she'd been taught, but she had no choice. Without assistance, she wouldn't make it far. Finally, she nodded. "Deal." Jake smiled, relieved. "Great. Let's get out of here, then. My truck's just over there." He gestured toward the dirt road where his old Jeep was parked. Lyra followed him cautiously, her eyes scanning the vehicle with fascination. It was crude compared to the ship she was used to, but it still intrigued her. As they climbed into the Jeep, Jake couldn't help but notice how Lyra gripped the edges of her seat tightly, her knuckles turning white. "You've never ridden in a car before, huh?" he asked, chuckling. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feels strange." Jake started the engine, and the rumble made Lyra jump. She stared at the dashboard, watching the needles move and the lights flicker. "What is this?" she asked, pointing to the speedometer. "It tells us how fast we're going," Jake explained. "Don't worry, I'll take it slow for you." Lyra nodded, though she still looked uneasy. As they drove, she pressed her face against the window, marveling at the passing scenery. Trees blurred together, and fields stretched endlessly under the bright blue sky. It was beautiful, but overwhelming. Everything moved so quickly, so chaotically. After a while, Jake broke the silence. "So, Lyra, why does this place matter so much to you? You're obviously not from around here, and that thing on your wrist looks pretty high-tech. What's the deal?" Lyra sighed, knowing she couldn't avoid the question forever. "My people need help," she began haltingly. "This place has something we need, something powerful. Without it," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jake frowned, piecing together her words. "Powerful, huh? Like energy or something?" "Yes," Lyra said, nodding. "Energy. Very important." Jake nodded slowly, processing the information. He didn't fully understand what she was talking about, but one thing was clear. Whatever she was after, it was serious. And judging by the way she carried herself, with determination mixed with fear, he knew she wasn't exaggerating. For the rest of the drive, They sat in companionable silence. Lyra continued to gaze out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Jake kept glancing at her, wondering how someone so small and seemingly fragile could carry such a heavy burden. Whatever her story was, he decided then and there that he'd do whatever he could to help her. Jake pulled the Jeep into the driveway of his small workshop, a weathered building tucked away on the edge of town. The place was cluttered but functional, with tools hanging on the walls and half-finished projects scattered across workbenches. Lyra stepped out of the vehicle cautiously, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. To her, it looked like organized chaos. Nothing like the sleek, sterile labs she was used to back home. "Welcome to my world," Jake said with a grin, grabbing a toolbox from the back of the Jeep. "Not much to look at, but it gets the job done." Lyra nodded, though she wasn't sure what to make of it. She wandered inside, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Her gaze lingered on a pile of metal parts stacked in the corner. They were rough and unpolished, nothing like the smooth, flawless materials she worked with. Still, there was something fascinating about them, a rawness that spoke of effort and creativity. Jake noticed her interest and gestured toward the pile. "That's scrap metal. I use it to fix things up. Nothing fancy, but it works." Lyra picked up a piece, turning it over in her hands. "You build with this?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah," Jake replied, shrugging. "It's not perfect, but sometimes you don't need perfect. You just need something that works." Lyra fell silent, pondering his words. On her planet, everything had to be precise, calculated. There was no room for error. But here, imperfection seemed to have its own kind of beauty. It made her wonder if her people had been too rigid in their ways, too focused on perfection to see other possibilities. Jake cleared his throat, pulling her attention back to the present. "So, mind showing me more about that map thing? If we're gonna figure out where you're headed, I'll need all the details." Lyra hesitated, then activated the holographic display on her wrist again. The map floated in the air between them, glowing faintly. Jake leaned in closer, studying the image. "Okay, so this volcano," he muttered, tracing the outline with his finger. "It's pretty remote. We'll have to take some back roads to get there. Might take a couple of days." "A couple of days," Lyra repeated, her voice rising slightly. She hadn't anticipated such a long journey. Time was critical, and every moment spent traveling felt like wasted opportunity. Jake noticed her concern and quickly added, "Don't worry. I'll drive as fast as I can without drawing attention. Besides, it's not safe to rush through these parts. Lots of wildlife and people you don't want to mess with." Lyra nodded reluctantly. She trusted Jake's judgment, even if she didn't fully understand it. He seemed knowledgeable about this world, which gave her some comfort. Still, the thought of spending days traveling through unfamiliar terrain filled her with unease. As they prepared for the trip, Jake rummaged through a cabinet and pulled out a few supplies: bottled water, snacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. "Just in case," he explained, tossing the items into a backpack. Lyra watched him curiously, noting how methodical he was. Despite the clutter around him, he moved with purpose, each action deliberate. "You're very organized," she observed, choosing her words carefully. Jake chuckled. "Well, when you spend most of your life fixing broken stuff, you learn to plan ahead. Never know when something might go wrong." His words struck a chord with Lyra. She thought about her mission, about how much could go wrong if she failed. Failure wasn't an option, not for her, not for her people. Yet standing here, surrounded by Jake's makeshift solutions, she began to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe perfection wasn't the only path forward. Before they left, Jake handed her a jacket. "Here, it gets cold at night, especially in the mountains. You'll need this." Lyra accepted it, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly, slipping it on. It was too big for her, but the warmth was comforting. For the first time since arriving on Earth, She felt a sense of security, not because of the jacket, but because of the person who had given it to her. As they climbed back into the Jeep, Jake glanced at her. Ready for round two? Lyra took a deep breath, steeling herself. Yes, she replied firmly. Let's go. The engine roared to life, and they set off once again, leaving the workshop behind. Lyra stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. She didn't know what awaited them, but one thing was certain: she wasn't alone anymore. And for now, that was enough. The Jeep bounced along the uneven dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that lingered in the air long after they passed. Lyra clutched the edges of her seat tightly, her knuckles white as she tried to steady herself against the jolts and bumps. Earth's gravity felt heavier than she was used to, and every movement seemed exaggerated, more forceful. She glanced at Jake, who sat calmly behind the wheel, his hand steady despite the rough terrain. "You're handling this well," Lyra said, her voice tinged with admiration. "It feels chaotic." Jake laughed, glancing at her briefly before focusing back on the road. "Chaotic? Nah, this is nothing. Wait till we hit the mountains. That's when it gets fun." Lyra frowned, unsure if he was joking or not. Fun wasn't the word she would use to describe their journey so far. Every turn, every bump, felt like a test of her endurance. She leaned forward slightly, peering through the windshield at the rugged landscape ahead. The trees grew thicker now, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out much of the sunlight. Shadows danced across the ground, making everything look darker, more mysterious. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, the road became narrower and more treacherous. Rocks jutted out from the dirt, forcing Jake to swerve frequently to avoid them. Lyra gripped the dashboard instinctively, her heart racing. "Is this normal?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Pretty much," Jake replied, grinning. "Like I said, it's not exactly a highway out here, but don't worry. I've got this." His confidence did little to ease her nerves. Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus on her breathing. She reminded herself why she was here: for her people, for their survival. This discomfort was temporary, a small price to pay for what lay ahead. Still, it didn't make the ride any easier. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the Jeep as something large crashed into the road ahead. Lyra gasped, her eyes snapping open. A deer stood frozen in the middle of the path, its wide eyes reflecting the dim light. Jake cursed under his breath, jerking the steering wheel to the side. The Jeep skidded dangerously, tires screeching as they fought for traction on the loose dirt. Lyra screamed, bracing herself as the vehicle swerved off the road and into the bushes. Her body slammed against the door, the impact knocking the wind out of her. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The engine sputtered, the world spun, and silence fell over the forest. Then, slowly, Jake turned to her, his face pale but calm. "You okay?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos. Lyra nodded shakily, though her hands trembled as she pushed herself upright. "I think so." Jake let out a relieved sigh. "Good. That was close." He glanced at the deer, which had bolted into the trees. "Guess we scared it more than it scared us." Lyra stared at him, her mind racing. Close didn't begin to describe what had just happened. To her, it felt like the universe itself was testing her resolve. How could she possibly succeed in such an unpredictable environment? Everything here was so much bigger, louder, and faster than she'd anticipated. "It's so huge," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "How can I control this?" Jake gave her a puzzled look. "What do you mean?" "You don't have to control anything. Just hang on and trust me, okay? I won't let anything happen to you." His words were meant to reassure her, but they only deepened her frustration. Trusting someone else wasn't part of her plan. Back home, she'd always relied solely on herself. Now, here she was, dependent on a human she barely knew, navigating a planet that felt alien in every way. Jake must have noticed her inner turmoil, because he reached over and patted her shoulder gently. "Hey, it's gonna be fine. We'll get through this together, all right?" Lyra looked at him, searching his face for signs of doubt, but all she saw was sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. With some effort, Jake managed to steer the jeep back onto the road. They continued their journey, the tension in the air gradually easing. Lyra stared out the window again, watching the endless expanse of trees blur past. Despite everything, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of determination. If humans could thrive in such a wild, untamed world, then surely she could too. For now, she decided to focus on one step at a time and hope that Jake truly meant what he said about keeping her safe. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Jake steered the jeep carefully along a narrow ridge that overlooked a deep valley. The air grew cooler, and the distant sound of crickets filled the silence. Lyra sat quietly beside him, her eyes scanning the darkening terrain. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Almost there," Jake said, breaking the quiet. He pointed toward a cluster of jagged peaks in the distance. "We'll set up camp near those foothills tonight. It's too risky to keep driving in the dark." Lyra nodded, though her unease lingered. Something about this place felt wrong, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She glanced at the glowing device on her wrist, which now displayed a faint warning signal. It pulsed softly, almost imperceptibly, but she noticed it immediately. Her people had programmed the device to detect any unusual energy signatures, and right now, it was telling her that something unnatural was nearby. Before she could say anything, movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from the trees ahead, dressed in dark clothing and holding what looked like a weapon. Lyra froze, her breath catching in her throat. Jake slowed the jeep, squinting at the stranger. "Who's that?" he muttered under his breath. The figure raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. Behind him, two more people stepped into view, their faces obscured by masks. They carried similar devices, sleek and metallic, unlike anything Lyra had seen humans use before. These weren't ordinary locals. They were trained, organized, and clearly looking for something. Jake turned to Lyra, his expression tense. "Do you know these guys?" Lyra shook her head quickly. "No, but they're not normal." The leader of the group approached the jeep, his voice sharp and commanding. "Turn off the engine and step out. Now." Jake hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to sound calm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he motioned to his companions, who fanned out around the vehicle, surrounding them. Lyra's heart raced as she realized they were trapped. She glanced at Jake, silently pleading for guidance. He gave her a subtle nod, his jaw tightening. All right," Jake said, raising his hand slightly. "No need to get jumpy." He turned off the engine and opened the door slowly, stepping out with deliberate movements. "We're just passing through. No trouble here." The leader ignored him, his focus shifting to Lyra. His eyes narrowed as he took in her silver suit and the glowing device on her wrist. "You're not from around here," he said, his tone cold. "Where did you come from? And why are you heading toward the volcano?" Lyra swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. These humans seemed to know more than they should. How could they possibly know about the crystals? Had someone tipped them off? Or worse, had her people sent others after her? Jake stepped forward, positioning himself between Lyra and the strangers. "Leave her alone," he said firmly. "She hasn't done anything wrong." The leader smirked, lowering his weapon slightly. "Stay out of this, friend. This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Jake shot back, his voice steady despite the danger. "If you've got a problem, take it up with me." For a moment, tension crackled in the air. Then, without warning, Lyra acted. She tapped a sequence on her wrist device, activating its defensive mode. A burst of light erupted from the gadget, blinding everyone momentarily. The strangers stumbled backward, shielding their eyes. Go, Lyra shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him toward the trees. He hesitated for only a second before following her lead. Together, they sprinted into the forest, dodging branches and leaping over roots as shouts echoed behind them. "They'll follow us," Jake panted, glancing over his shoulder. Sure enough, the figures were giving chase, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "I know," Lyra replied, her mind racing. "But I can slow them down." She stopped abruptly and pressed another button on her device. A low hum filled the air, followed by the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves. Vines shot up from the ground, tangling around their pursuers' legs and halting their progress. The strangers cursed loudly, struggling to free themselves. Jake and Lyra finally slowed to a stop in a small clearing, their chests heaving as they caught their breath. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the usual chirping of insects replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. Jake glanced back toward the direction they had come, half expecting to see flashlights cutting through the trees or voices calling out after them. But there was nothing, just darkness and shadows. "They're not following us," Jake said quietly, though his tone carried more hope than certainty. "At least, not yet." Lyra nodded, leaning against a tree for support. Her legs felt weak, and her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the glowing device on her wrist. She knew the vines wouldn't hold those strangers forever. They were persistent, well-equipped, and clearly desperate to find her. But why? What did they know about the crystals? Jake noticed her unease and stepped closer, his voice softening. "Hey, we've got some time now. You want to tell me what's really going on? Who were those guys?" Lyra hesitated, torn between keeping her mission secret and trusting Jake. He had already risked so much for her, risked his safety, maybe even his life. She owed him the truth. Taking a deep breath, she began to explain. "My people are dying," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Our world is running out of energy. Without it, our cities will fall, our machines will stop working, and everything we've built will collapse. We found traces of powerful crystals buried deep within your planet's crust. These crystals can save us, but they're dangerous. If handled wrong, they could hurt this world too." Jake listened intently, his brow furrowed. "So that's why you're here? To get these crystals?" "Yes," Lyra replied, nodding. "But I didn't expect others to be looking for them too. Those men, they're not like you. They don't care about protecting Earth. All they want is power." Jake frowned, piecing together what she was saying. "You think someone tipped them off? Like whoever sent you?" Lyra shook her head quickly. "No, my leaders wouldn't do that. This mission, it's supposed to be secret. Only a few know about it." Her voice trailed off, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Could she trust her own people completely, or had someone betrayed her? Jake saw the doubt in her eyes and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "All right, let's focus on one thing at a time. First, we need to figure out how to keep moving without getting caught. Second, we need to decide what to do once we reach the volcano. And third," he paused, his voice growing quieter, "we need to make sure neither of our worlds gets hurt in the process." Lyra looked at him, surprised by his calm determination. Humans were unpredictable, yes, but Jake was different. He cared about doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. It reminded her of stories she'd heard about Earth, a planet where kindness and courage often went hand in hand. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "for helping me." Jake smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess. Not by a long shot." They decided to rest briefly before continuing their journey, knowing they couldn't afford to waste too much time. As they sat under the stars, Jake pulled out a small flashlight and shone it over a crumpled map he kept in his backpack. "If we cut through this ravine, we might be able to avoid any more run-ins with those guys," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "It'll take longer, but it's safer. Lyra studied the map, memorizing the path. I can help, she offered. My device can detect movement ahead of us. If anyone tries to ambush us again, I'll know. Jake nodded approvingly. Good thinking. We'll need all the advantages we can get. As they prepared to leave, Lyra glanced up at the night sky, her thoughts drifting to her home planet. She wondered if her leaders were watching, waiting for her success or failure. The weight of her mission pressed down on her, heavier than ever. But then she looked at Jake, who was checking the Jeep's tires for damage, and felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could help her navigate this strange, chaotic world, it was him. We should go, she said, standing up straighter. Before they catch up. Jake grabbed his backpack and nodded. Lead the way. Together, they disappeared into the darkness, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The forest grew denser as Jake and Lyra pressed onward, the narrow path barely visible under the dim light of the stars. The air was thick with humidity, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. Lyra stayed close to Jake, her glowing wrist device casting faint shadows on the ground. She kept it active, scanning for any signs of movement ahead. So far, the coast was clear, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Jake adjusted the strap of his backpack, shifting its weight to ease the ache in his shoulders. You sure this ravine is the best way? He asked, glancing over his shoulder at Lyra. Feels like we're walking in circles. It's safer, Lyra replied, her voice firm despite the exhaustion creeping into her tone. If we stay off the main roads, they'll have a harder time finding us. Jake nodded, trusting her judgment. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him tense. He glanced behind them frequently, half expecting to see flashlights or hear voices calling out. But the forest remained eerily silent, too silent. As they reached the edge of the ravine, Jake stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to signal Lyra to do the same. Below them, the ground dropped sharply into a steep, rocky slope. It wasn't impassable, but it would slow them down considerably, and at the bottom, a narrow stream wound its way through jagged stones, reflecting faint moonlight. This is gonna be tricky, Jake muttered, crouching to get a better look. We'll need to take it slow. One wrong step, and we could end up tumbling all the way down. Lyra knelt beside him, studying the terrain. I can help, she said quietly. My suit has stabilizers. If you hold on to me, I can guide us safely. Jake raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but willing to try. All right, lead the way. But if either of us starts sliding, we bail together. Got it. Lyra nodded, gripping his arm firmly. They began their descent, moving cautiously along the uneven surface. Loose rocks shifted underfoot, threatening to send them slipping, but Lyra's suit emitted a soft hum, steadying them both. Jake marveled at the technology, grateful for the assist. Without it, they'd likely still be stuck at the top, or worse, injured. Halfway down, they heard it, a distant shout carried by the wind. Both froze, hearts pounding. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was definitely following them. They found us, Lyra whispered, panic rising in her chest. She glanced at her wrist device, which now pulsed rapidly. Whoever was tracking them was using advanced equipment not native to Earth. Jake cursed under his breath. We need to move faster. Can your suit handle it? Yes, Lyra replied, though uncertainty lingered in her voice. She tightened her grip on Jake's arm and quickened their pace, the hum of her stabilizers growing louder as they navigated the treacherous slope. When they finally reached the bottom, both collapsed onto the damp ground, breathing heavily. The stream gurgled softly beside them, masking the sound of their labored breaths. Above them, shadows moved along the ridge, dark figures scanning the area. We can't stay here, Jake said urgently, pulling himself to his feet. They'll find us soon. Lyra nodded, already thinking ahead. Follow the stream. It will lead us deeper into the forest. They won't expect us to go that way. Jake didn't argue. Together, they waded into the icy water, the cold biting at their legs. The current was gentle, just enough to carry the sound of their movements away from prying ears. As they moved, Lyra activated another function on her wrist device, a cloaking field that distorted their appearance to anyone watching from afar. It wouldn't hold up under close scrutiny, but it might buy them some time. Hours passed as they trudged through the forest, the adrenaline keeping them going despite their fatigue. Eventually, they found shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind thick vines. Collapsing inside, they listened intently for any signs of pursuit. For now, at least, they were safe. Jake leaned against the cave wall, closing his eyes briefly. "This isn't gonna get easier, is it?" "No," Lyra admitted softly. "But we don't have a choice. We have to keep going." Jake looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. Despite everything, she hadn't given up, and neither would he. The cave provided little comfort, but it was enough to shield them from the eyes of those hunting them. Jake sat cross-legged on the cold ground, his flashlight casting a weak beam against the rocky walls. Lyra leaned against the far side of the cave, her glowing wrist device dimmed to conserve energy. Both were silent, lost in their thoughts as fatigue tugged at their bodies. "We're running out of time," Lyra said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Jake look up immediately. "What do you mean?" he asked, shifting closer to her. "You've been holding your own so far." Lyra shook her head, frustration flickering across her face. "It's not just about staying ahead of them. The longer we delay, the more chances they have to find us, and the crystals. If they get there first." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The thought of what might happen if the wrong hands claimed the crystals terrified her. Jake nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "All right, let's think this through. How much farther is it to the volcano?" "Not far," Lyra replied, consulting her device. "A few hours' walk if we move quickly. But once we're inside, things will get harder. The caverns are unstable, and the crystals, they're dangerous." "How dangerous?" Jake pressed, his tone serious. Lyra hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "They emit energy, powerful energy. Too much exposure can harm living beings. My suit protects me, but you—" She glanced at him, concern etched on her face. "You'll need to stay back when we get close." Jake frowned, shaking his head. "No way. I'm not letting you go in alone. Not after everything we've been through." "It's not safe," Lyra snapped, her voice rising slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I don't want you getting hurt because of me. And I don't want you facing whatever's waiting for us on your own." Jake shot back, his voice firm but kind. "Look, I may not know much about your world or these crystals, but I do know one thing. Teamwork beats going solo every time. So we stick together, all right?" Lyra stared at him, torn between arguing further and accepting his help. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "All right. But you follow my lead once we're inside. No arguments." "Deal," Jake agreed, offering a small smile. They rested for a while longer before setting out again, moving cautiously through the forest. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The beauty of the sunrise did little to ease the tension hanging over them. Every step felt heavier, each sound sharper. They both knew they were approaching the final stretch, and the most dangerous part of their journey. By mid-morning, they reached the base of the dormant volcano. Its massive form loomed above them, its jagged peak shrouded in mist. A narrow opening led into the mountain's depths, dark and foreboding. Lyra paused, gazing up at the towering structure. This was it, the place her people had sent her to retrieve the crystals. It felt surreal, standing here after all they'd endured to get this far. "You ready?" Jake asked, noticing her hesitation. Lyra nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. "Yes, let's go." They entered the cavern cautiously, the air growing cooler and damper the deeper they went. The light from Jake's flashlight illuminated the rough stone walls, revealing strange mineral deposits that shimmered faintly. Lyra's wrist device began to pulse faster, reacting to the energy emanating from within the mountain. As they ventured further, the path narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Suddenly, Lyra stopped, raising a hand to signal Jake to do the same. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a large chamber, its center bathed in an otherworldly glow. Embedded in the rock was the crystal, a pulsating mass of radiant energy that seemed alive. "There it is," Lyra whispered, awe mingling with fear in her voice. But before they could move closer, voices echoed from behind them. Heavy boots clattered against the stone floor, growing louder with each passing second. Their pursuers had caught up. Jake turned to Lyra, urgency in his eyes. "We don't have much time. What's the plan?" Lyra clenched her fists, determination hardening her expression. "I stabilized the crystal. You keep them away from me." Jake nodded, stepping forward. "Got it. Let's make this count." With no time to waste, they moved into the chamber, ready to face whatever came next. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. The crystal glowed fiercely at the center, casting eerie light across the rocky walls. Lyra moved toward it cautiously, her wrist device humming as it synchronized with the energy radiating from the stone. Jake positioned himself near the tunnel entrance, gripping a heavy piece of rock he picked up along the way. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it would have to do. Moments later, the first figure appeared, a man dressed in dark tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask. Behind him came more, their weapons pointed directly at Jake and Lyra. At the front stood Angela Drake, the ruthless executive who had been orchestrating the hunt for the crystals. Her sharp eyes locked onto the glowing stone, then shifted to Lyra. "Well, well," Angela said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like we got ourselves an alien treasure hunter." She stepped forward, ignoring the tension in the room. "Hand over the crystal, sweetheart. You don't know how to handle it." Lyra straightened, her expression defiant despite the fear coursing through her. "You won't use it for good. My people need it to survive." Angela smirked, waving a hand dismissively. "Survive? That's cute. This isn't about survival. It's about power. And I always get what I want." Jake tightened his grip on the rock, stepping closer to block her path. "Not today," he growled, his voice low and steady. "You're not getting anywhere near her, or that thing." Angela chuckled, unimpressed. She nodded to one of her men, who raised his weapon. "Take care of him." Before anyone could act, Lyra tapped a sequence on her wrist device. A burst of energy shot out, creating a shimmering barrier between them and Angela's team. The mercenaries stumbled back, startled by the sudden obstruction. Jake turned to Lyra, wide-eyed. "How long will that hold?" he asked quickly. "Not long," she admitted, her voice strained. "I need time to stabilize the crystal. Please, keep them busy." Jake nodded, determination hardening his features. He hurled the rock at the nearest mercenary, striking him in the shoulder. The man grunted in pain, giving Jake enough time to duck behind a boulder for cover. Gunfire erupted, ricocheting off the stone as Angela shouted orders. Chaos filled the chamber, echoing loudly against the walls. Meanwhile, Lyra focused all her attention on the crystal. Her hands hovered over its surface, trembling slightly as she adjusted the settings on her wrist device. The energy flowing from the stone was overwhelming, making her head spin. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, but she refused to give up. She could feel the crystal responding, its glow intensifying as it stabilized. "You can't win," Angela yelled, her patience wearing thin. She signaled two of her men to circle around, attempting to flank Jake. One managed to slip past, only to be tackled by Jake before he could reach Lyra. They wrestled on the ground, the mercenary stronger but less agile. With a final shove, Jake pinned him down, knocking him unconscious. Back at the barrier, cracks began to form in the shimmering shield. Lyra glanced over her shoulder, panic rising in her chest. "Almost done," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the commotion. Jake fought desperately, using every ounce of strength to hold off Angela's team. But he was outnumbered, and exhaustion was setting in. A blow to his side sent him sprawling, leaving him vulnerable. Angela stepped forward, a smug grin spreading across her face. "That's enough," she said coldly, raising her weapon. But before she could fire, a blinding flash of light erupted from the crystal. The force of the energy surge knocked everyone off their feet, sending rocks tumbling from the ceiling. When the dust settled, Lyra stood alone beside the now stable crystal, her body shaking with effort. "It's ready," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She activated the teleportation function on her wrist device, knowing what she had to do. Turning to Jake, who lay dazed on the ground, she crouched beside him. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I can't stay." Jake reached out, grabbing her hand weakly. "Don't go," he pleaded, though he already knew it was futile. Lyra hesitated, then pressed something into his palm, a small glowing fragment of the crystal. "For Earth," she said simply. Then, with a final flash of light, she vanished, taking the crystal with her. Angela and her team staggered to their feet, staring at the empty space where Lyra had been. Jake sat up slowly, clutching the fragment tightly. Despite everything, he couldn't help but smile. She had kept her promise. Back aboard her ship, Lyra collapsed into the pilot's seat, her body trembling with exhaustion. The crystal rested securely in a containment unit beside her, its glow now steady and calm. She had done it. She had completed her mission. But the cost weighed heavily on her heart. Jake's face lingered in her mind, his voice echoing in her thoughts. He had been kind, brave, and selfless, a true friend in a world that had felt so alien to her. Leaving him behind felt like losing a part of herself. Taking a deep breath, she activated the communicator built into the ship's console. After a moment of static, Jake's voice came through, faint but clear. "Lyra, are you there?" Her eyes filled with tears at the sound of his voice. "I'm here," she replied softly. "I wanted to say thank you." Jake hesitated, his tone tinged with sadness. "You didn't have to leave. You could have stayed." "I couldn't," Lyra said, shaking her head even though he couldn't see her. "My people need this crystal. And Earth. Earth needs you." There was a long pause before Jake spoke again. "You kept your promise. You protected both our worlds." Lyra smiled faintly, clutching the edge of the console. "I'll never forget you, Jake. Never." "Same here," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Take care of yourself out there, okay?" "I will," she promised. Then, before she could change her mind, she ended the transmission. Tears streamed down her face as the ship began its ascent, breaking through Earth's atmosphere and disappearing into the vastness of space. On Earth, Jake stood alone in the forest clearing where Lyra's ship had once been. The small fragment of the crystal she had given him glowed faintly in his hand, warm to the touch. He stared up at the sky, watching until the last trace of light from her ship faded. Despite the ache in his chest, he felt a strange sense of peace. She had saved both their worlds, and in doing so, she had changed his life forever. Days turned into weeks, and Jake returned to his workshop, resuming his quiet life. But things were different now. Strange phenomena began occurring worldwide. Plants grew faster, polluted rivers cleared, and weather patterns shifted subtly for the better. Scientists scrambled to explain the changes, but Jake knew the truth. The fragment of the crystal pulsed softly in his pocket, a reminder of the bond he shared with Lyra and the sacrifice she had made. One evening, as he sat outside his workshop gazing at the stars, Jake found himself smiling. Somewhere out there, Lyra was continuing her journey, carrying the hope of her people with her. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he held on to the belief that their paths might cross someday. For now, though, he was content to honor her gift by living fully and protecting the planet they had both fought so hard to save. The night breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers, signs of Earth's renewal. Jake closed his eyes, letting the sounds of nature wash over him. "Thank you, Lyra," he whispered into the darkness, "wherever you are." Above him, the stars twinkled brightly, silent witnesses to the connection between two worlds, and the courage of one extraordinary woman who had bridged them.